America doesn't just survive disasters, sometimes it slaps a price tag on them. Keep watching, because the deeper we go, the more memorial starts looking like merch table. 1. Mount St. Helens ash became a souvenir when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. It was not a cute little science fair volcano. It blasted ash across Washington, shut down roads, disrupted airports, damaged engines, and turned entire communities into gray, gritty cleanup projects. Normal reaction? Panic? Masks? Shovels? American reaction? Can we put this in a little bag and sell it? And yes, people did exactly that. Volcanic ash from the eruption was sold as a souvenir, and a Washington geological report even noted that selling the ash as eruption memorabilia had proven especially profitable. That is peak disaster capitalism. Nature explodes, people run, and somewhere a guy is thinking, this would look great next to a cash register. Eventually, Mount St. Helens ash was even turned into green glass jewelry called Helenite, because nothing says historic catastrophe like earrings made from mountain dust. 2. The 9/11 Museum gift shop controversy. The National September 11th Memorial and Museum was built to honor victims, preserve memory, and help people understand one of the darkest days in modern American history. Then visitors noticed something awkward: a gift shop. Now, museum stores are normal. But this was not a dinosaur exhibit where you buy a plastic T-Rex and a pencil. This was sacred ground for thousands of grieving families. In 2014, backlash erupted over items being sold there, including a US-shaped ceramic platter marked with the attack locations. The museum removed that item after criticism and said family members would help review future merchandise. The museum argued that store revenue helped support its mission, which is practical but still emotionally strange. Because there is no smooth way to walk from tragedy into retail lighting and ask, do you want the commemorative bracelet or the hoodie? 3. Titanic artifacts became a touring business. The Titanic sank in 1912, taking more than 1,500 lives and becoming one of history's most famous maritime disasters. Naturally, over time, the wreck became not just a grave site, but an attraction. RMS Titanic Incorporated has displayed recovered artifacts in exhibitions, and Titanic artifact shows have attracted millions of visitors worldwide. That part can be educational, but the uncomfortable question never leaves the room. When does preservation become packaging? In 2026, a plan to auction more than 100 Titanic artifacts faced opposition from the US government, with NOAA arguing the collection should remain together instead of being broken up and sold. The proposed sale reportedly included personal items and decorative pieces. Imagine surviving history as a shoe, a pendant, or a kitchen object, only to end up in a bidding war. The ocean kept the Titanic for decades. Then humans showed up with brochures, ticket booths, and auction paperwork. 4. The Hindenburg disaster filled newspaper stands. The Hindenburg disaster in 1937 was one of the first major catastrophes to become a media sensation almost instantly. When the massive German airship burst into flames while attempting to land in New Jersey, 36 people lost their lives. The shocking newsreel footage and Herbert Morrison's emotional radio broadcast, complete with his unforgettable cry, "Oh, the humanity," were replayed across America. But alongside the genuine grief came an enormous commercial opportunity. Newspapers rushed out special editions that sold in record numbers, while newsreel theaters advertised exclusive footage to eager audiences. People lined up and paid admission just to watch the disaster unfold on screen. The tragedy became one of the earliest examples of catastrophe turning into mass entertainment. Nobody had planned for it, yet businesses quickly realized that the public desperately wanted to see history with their own eyes. It's an uncomfortable reminder that Americans have always had a fascination with dramatic moments. Long before social media turned disasters into viral content, movie theaters were already selling tickets to yesterday's tragedy, proving that if something shocked the nation, someone would eventually find a way to sell a front row seat. 5. The San Francisco earthquake created a postcard industry. When the devastating San Francisco earthquake struck on April 18, 1906, followed by fires that burned for days, more than half the city was destroyed and thousands of people lost their homes. Yet, almost immediately, photographers began documenting the destruction. Their images weren't locked away in government archives, they became postcards. Within weeks, visitors and publishers were selling photographs of collapsed buildings, burned neighborhoods, and smoking ruins. Tourists mailed them across the country with cheerful messages describing their visit, creating one of the strangest combinations imaginable: disaster and vacation souvenirs. For many Americans, these postcards offered the first real glimpse of the catastrophe. They were historical documents, but they were also commercial products sold by the thousands. Looking back, it's a little surreal to imagine someone standing beside a ruined city block thinking, "This would make a nice postcard for Aunt Martha." But that's exactly what happened. America has always had a talent for turning history into something you could slip into an envelope, stamp, and mail across the country before the ashes had fully settled. 6. Ford sold safety. After every highway tragedy. The post-war boom filled America's highways with millions of new drivers, but it also brought a sharp rise in deadly traffic accidents. By the 1950s, automobile crashes had become a national concern, and car companies realized something important. Fear could sell cars just as effectively as horsepower. Ford leaned into this idea in 1956 when it introduced the Lifeguard Design Safety Campaign, promoting padded dashboards, deeper steering wheels, improved door latches, and optional seatbelts. These weren't invented because of one single disaster, but because years of horrifying crashes had convinced Americans that safety mattered. Ford transformed those fears into one of the biggest advertising campaigns in automotive history. The message was simple: terrible accidents will happen, but maybe they don't have to happen to you. Ironically, many buyers ignored the safety features because chrome trim and powerful V8 engines seemed more exciting. Still, the campaign changed the conversation forever. America had looked at thousands of highway tragedies and discovered that even fear could become a marketing strategy if you wrapped it in shiny paint and parked it in a dealership showroom. 7. Chicago turned its Great Fire into a tourist attraction. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed thousands of buildings, left roughly 100,000 people homeless, and transformed one of America's fastest-growing cities overnight. It was a genuine catastrophe. But as Chicago rebuilt, something unexpected happened. Visitors began arriving specifically to see where the fire had happened. Entrepreneurs responded exactly as you'd expect. Guided tours pointed out famous locations connected to the disaster. Bookstores sold illustrated accounts of the fire, and souvenir publishers produced engravings, maps, and photographs showing the destruction. Even the legendary story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, despite never being proven true, became part of the city's commercial identity for decades. The fire that nearly erased Chicago somehow became one of the reasons people wanted to visit it. Instead of trying to hide the scars, the city eventually embraced them as part of its history. It's a fascinating piece of American culture. We don't always bury disasters. Sometimes we build museums around them, print guidebooks, and charge admission. If history brings enough curious visitors, yesterday's nightmare can quietly become tomorrow's sightseeing stop. 8. Hurricane Katrina became a tourism debate. When Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast in 2005, it devastated New Orleans, caused more than 1,800 deaths, and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. The city faced an enormous challenge. How could tourism return without turning tragedy into entertainment? Before long, companies began offering guided bus tours through neighborhoods that had suffered catastrophic flooding, including the lower Ninth Ward. Some operators argued that the tours educated visitors about the storm, the levee failures, and the city's recovery. Others believed they crossed an ethical line by treating devastated communities like tourist attractions. The debate became national news. Was this education or disaster tourism? The answer depended on who you asked. Some residents appreciated visitors learning the real story instead of relying on headlines. Others felt uncomfortable watching buses slowly roll past homes that had become symbols of unimaginable loss. It perfectly captured an American contradiction. We genuinely want people to remember disasters and understand their impact, but we also have an uncanny ability to package almost any experience into something that comes with a ticket, a schedule, and a souvenir shop waiting nearby. 9. The Dust Bowl became a Hollywood backdrop. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s was one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. Years of drought and poor farming practices turned millions of acres across the Great Plains into clouds of choking dust. Families abandoned their homes, crops failed, and thousands headed west, hoping to find work. It was a humanitarian crisis that reshaped the country. But Hollywood saw something else, an unforgettable setting. Throughout the late 1930s and 1940s, films, documentaries, and newsreels used the haunting landscapes to tell stories of hardship and survival. Studios also sold those stories to audiences hungry for dramatic realism. Even photographers working for the Farm Security Administration created iconic images that later appeared in books, exhibitions, and licensed publications. The suffering was very real, but it also became part of America's cultural product. Somehow, endless fields of dust became visual history that people paid to see. It's a strange contradiction. One generation desperately tried to escape those black dust storms, while the next bought movie tickets to watch actors walk through carefully recreated versions of them under perfectly controlled studio lights. 10. The Gold Rush turned ghost towns into businesses. When the California gold rush exploded in 1848, thousands of people rushed west, convinced they would strike it rich. Most didn't. Countless mining camps emptied almost as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind abandoned buildings, empty saloons, and dusty streets. For years, these ghost towns slowly crumbled under the western sun. Then, someone had an idea. Instead of mining for gold, why not mine for tourists? Towns like Bodie, California, eventually became historic attractions where visitors could wander through preserved streets, buy guidebooks, postcards, souvenirs, and experience life in a real frontier boomtown. Ironically, many businesses have earned far more money from tourists than the original miners ever pulled from the ground. The gold disappeared long ago, but the stories never stopped paying. America looked at entire abandoned communities and realized they still had value. Not because there was treasure beneath the ground anymore, but because there was something people have always loved buying: a chance to step into history for an afternoon before heading back to a comfortable hotel with air conditioning. 11. The Salem witch trials became a tourist economy. The Salem witch trials of 1692 remain one of the darkest chapters in early American history. 20 innocent people were executed after being falsely accused of witchcraft during a wave of fear and hysteria. It should simply be remembered as a warning about mass panic and injustice. Instead, over 3 centuries later, Salem has become one of America's busiest Halloween destinations. Every October, millions of visitors arrive to tour museums, historic cemeteries, memorials, walking tours, and shops selling everything from witch hats to themed candles. To be fair, many museums present the trials with historical accuracy and respect, but it's still impossible to ignore the unusual contrast. A place once consumed by fear now thrives on tourism, inspired by the very tragedy that nearly destroyed it. The victims are honored, yet the town also benefits economically from an event that should never have happened. Salem somehow managed to transform one of America's greatest miscarriages of justice into an educational destination that also happens to sell a remarkable number of souvenir broomsticks. 12. The Alcatraz prison closed, then started selling tickets. For nearly 30 years, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary housed some of America's most notorious criminals, including Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, and Robert Stroud, better known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. The prison earned a reputation for being nearly impossible to escape, although several inmates famously tried. Operating the island prison became extremely expensive, and the federal government finally closed it in 1963. That could have been the end of the story. Instead, it became the beginning of a very profitable second life. Today, Alcatraz is one of the most visited sites in the National Park Service, attracting well over 1 million visitors each year. People happily buy ferry tickets, audio tours narrated by former guards and inmates, books, photographs, and souvenirs. Think about that for a second. Prisoners once dreamed of escaping the island. Today, tourists pay in advance for the privilege of being locked inside for an hour or two. America somehow turned one of its most feared prisons into one of its most popular vacation stops, proving that even maximum security eventually became maximum tourism. 13. Route 66 sold America's hard times. Route 66 wasn't created by disaster, but the hardships surrounding it certainly helped turn it into a legend. During the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, hundreds of thousands of families traveled the highway, searching for work and a better future in California. John Steinbeck famously called it the Mother Road, and for many people, it represented survival rather than adventure. Decades later, that painful history became part of its commercial appeal. Today, visitors from around the world drive Route 66 looking for vintage diners, old gas stations, neon signs, and roadside museums celebrating the very era when countless families struggled just to survive. Entire towns now depend on tourists chasing nostalgia for one of America's toughest periods. It's one of history's greatest ironies. What was once a desperate road of hope has become the ultimate American road trip. Somewhere along the way, hardship became heritage, and survival became a souvenir. Leave it to America to transform an escape route into one of the country's most marketable vacation experiences. 14. Chernobyl souvenirs were banned. But 3 Mile Island wasn't. When the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident occurred in Pennsylvania in 1979, Americans watched the news with genuine fear. Although the partial reactor meltdown caused no immediate deaths and released only limited radiation, public confidence in nuclear power was shaken for decades. Yet the site soon became a symbol that attracted curious visitors. Local museums, books, documentaries, newspaper specials, and educational exhibits explored the event in detail. Businesses nearby sold books, photographs, and memorabilia connected to one of America's most famous industrial accidents. Unlike places where strict exclusion zones prevent tourism, 3 Mile Island gradually became part of America's historical landscape. People wanted to understand what happened, and publishers, filmmakers, and museums were happy to meet that demand. It wasn't exploitation in the traditional sense, it was education mixed with commerce. Once again, America demonstrated an unusual habit. Even when something scares the entire country, someone eventually figures out how to package the story into something visitors can experience, discuss, and, of course, purchase on the way out. 15. The Great Flood of 1993 filled more than rivers. The Great Flood of 1993 devastated communities across the Midwest after months of relentless rain caused the Mississippi and Missouri rivers to overflow. Entire towns disappeared underwater, thousands of homes were destroyed, and economic losses reached billions of dollars. It was one of the most expensive natural disasters in American history. Yet, almost immediately after the waters receded, visitors began traveling to affected areas simply to witness the scale of the destruction. Local businesses responded by printing flood maps, commemorative books, photo collections, and documentaries that helped preserve the memory while also supporting struggling communities. Museums later created permanent exhibits explaining how the disaster unfolded and how towns rebuilt themselves. In many places, tourism became part of the recovery. That's probably the most American response imaginable. First, rebuild everything, then explain what happened, then sell the guidebook. There's something oddly hopeful about that cycle. The flood took away homes, roads, and businesses, but it couldn't wash away people's determination to tell the story, and eventually turn that story into something future generations would come to see with their own eyes. 16. The Challenger explosion changed television forever. On January 28, 1986, millions of Americans watched the Space Shuttle Challenger lift off live on television. 73 seconds later, the shuttle broke apart, killing all 7 crew members, including teacher Krista McAuliffe. It was a national tragedy that stunned the country. Yet television networks quickly realized that the footage had become one of the most important historical recordings ever captured. News specials, documentaries, educational films, anniversary programs, and VHS collections were released for years afterward. Schools used the recordings to teach engineering, decision-making, and risk management. Publishers produced books explaining what went wrong, while museums built exhibits around the disaster. Nobody celebrated the tragedy itself, but America undeniably found a way to preserve and sell the story. The explosion became part of television history, generating documentaries and educational programming for decades. It's an uncomfortable reality. Some moments are simply too significant to disappear. In America, preserving history often means packaging it for future audiences. Even the darkest chapters eventually find their way into bookstores, museum gift shops, and streaming services, reminding us that remembrance and commerce often travel side by side. 17. The Exxon Valdez oil spill filled bookstores. When the Exxon Valdez ran aground in Alaska in 1989, nearly 11 million gallons of crude oil spilled into Prince William Sound. Thousands of seabirds, sea otters, seals, and other wildlife were killed, while fishing communities faced years of economic hardship. It became one of America's worst environmental disasters. But as cleanup crews worked along the coastline, another industry quietly emerged. Publishers rushed to release books explaining the accident, photographers documented the environmental damage, television networks produced specials, and documentary filmmakers followed every stage of the cleanup. Visitors even traveled to Alaska hoping to understand the scale of the disaster for themselves. Local museums eventually included exhibits about the spill, preserving both the environmental lessons and the human stories behind it. Nobody wanted the spill to happen, but once it did, the demand for information became enormous. America has a habit of turning tragedy into education, and education into an industry. Sometimes that's necessary. After all, history is easier to remember when it's printed on glossy pages sitting on a bookstore shelf beside the latest travel guide. 18. The Titanic movie created an entire souvenir boom. The sinking of the Titanic happened in the North Atlantic, but America's response decades later perfectly fits this story. When James Cameron's Titanic premiered in 1997, it became a cultural phenomenon. Suddenly, museums featuring Titanic artifacts saw attendance explode. Gift shops expanded overnight, selling books, replica jewelry, model ships, clothing, coffee mugs, and even reproductions of first-class dinner menus. Traveling exhibitions attracted millions of visitors across the United States, many of whom left carrying shopping bags almost as full as their cameras. The tragedy itself hadn't changed. What changed was public fascination. A disaster that had already inspired generations suddenly became one of the biggest merchandising opportunities in museum history. Educational exhibits genuinely helped people understand the ship's story, but they also proved something uniquely American. If enough people become interested in history, someone will eventually produce a t-shirt, a Christmas ornament, and a collectible snow globe. It's impossible not to smile at the irony. The world's most famous maritime disaster somehow found a second life in museum gift shops, proving that nostalgia can be just as profitable as entertainment. 19. The Oklahoma City bombing became a place of learning. The bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995, killed 168 people and shocked the nation. It remains one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in American history. Years later, the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum was established to honor the victims and educate future generations. Like many museums, it includes a carefully designed gift shop. The merchandise focuses on remembrance, resilience, and educational materials rather than novelty items, with proceeds supporting the museum's mission. Even so, the existence of a store inside a place built around unimaginable loss has sparked thoughtful conversations about where remembrance ends and commerce begins. The reality is complicated. Museums need funding, and visitors often want books or keepsakes that help them remember what they've learned. America frequently walks this delicate line. We build powerful memorials to ensure tragedies are never forgotten, then discover that preserving those memories requires financial support. Sometimes that support arrives through donations. Sometimes it arrives when someone quietly buys a history book before leaving. 20. The Johnstown flood turned ruins into tourism. The Johnstown flood of 1889 remains one of the deadliest disasters in American history. After the South Fork Dam failed in Pennsylvania, a wall of water swept through Johnstown, killing more than 2,200 people in just minutes. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath mud and debris. In the months that followed, thousands of curious visitors traveled to see the destruction with their own eyes. Hotels filled, local businesses sold photographs of the devastation, and publishers produced illustrated accounts describing the catastrophe. Decades later, the Johnstown Flood National Memorial preserved the story through exhibits, films, books, and educational programs that continue attracting visitors today. It may sound strange, but disaster tourism isn't a modern invention. Americans were already boarding trains in the 19th century to witness the aftermath of historic events. Human curiosity has always been powerful. We want to understand what happened, where it happened, and how people survived. Eventually, that curiosity becomes museums, visitor centers, bookstores, and guided tours. History doesn't simply fade away. In America, it often becomes a destination marked by highway signs and a parking lot. 21. The Chicago Tylenol murders changed packaging and sold it. In 1982, 7 people in the Chicago area died after taking extra-strength Tylenol capsules that had been secretly laced with cyanide by an unknown criminal. The murders terrified the country because they proved danger could be hiding inside an everyday medicine cabinet. Americans suddenly stopped trusting products that looked perfectly normal. The tragedy forced one of the biggest changes in consumer packaging history. Johnson & Johnson introduced tamper-evident packaging, triple safety seals, and stronger consumer protections that quickly became the industry standard. Other manufacturers followed almost immediately. In a way, America looked at a terrifying crisis and transformed safety itself into a selling point. Advertisements no longer focused only on effectiveness. They proudly showed sealed caps, protective rings, and safety wrappers. Consumers were encouraged to buy products because they were harder to tamper with. It was one of the rare moments when marketing genuinely made people safer. Still, the irony remains impossible to ignore. A national tragedy permanently changed how millions of products were sold, proving that even trust can become something companies advertise right on the package. 22. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Fire sold a safer future. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City in 1911 claimed the lives of 146 garment workers, most of them young immigrant women. Locked exit doors, inadequate fire escapes, and overcrowded working conditions turned a workplace accident into one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history. The tragedy led to sweeping labor reforms, but it also changed the way businesses marketed themselves. Manufacturers of fireproof doors, sprinkler systems, alarms, and industrial safety equipment suddenly had something they had never possessed before: a public desperate for protection. Trade magazines filled with advertisements promising that modern safety systems could prevent another Triangle disaster. Companies weren't selling fear for its own sake. They were selling reassurance. Factories proudly promoted their new safety standards to workers and investors alike. It's one of those moments where commerce and progress moved in the same direction. America looked at a horrific factory fire and built an entire industry around making workplaces safer. The irony is impossible to miss. One terrible disaster became the reason thousands of businesses proudly advertised the things nobody had noticed before: emergency exits, sprinklers, and unlocked doors. 23. The Great Boston Molasses Flood became a tourist curiosity. In January 1919, a massive storage tank in Boston suddenly burst, releasing more than 2 million gallons of molasses into the streets. The sticky wave raced through the North End at speeds estimated around 35 miles per hour, destroying buildings, overturning wagons, and killing 21 people. It sounds almost fictional, but it happened. Newspapers across America couldn't print enough copies because readers were fascinated by a disaster involving something normally poured over pancakes. Over time, the strange tragedy became part of Boston's identity. History books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and guided walking tours now tell visitors exactly where the flood occurred. Local bookstores carry books dedicated entirely to the event, while tourists eagerly photograph streets where rivers of molasses once flowed. It's a perfect example of America's unusual relationship with history. Even one of the strangest industrial accidents ever recorded eventually became something visitors actively seek out. The city doesn't celebrate the tragedy itself. Instead, it preserves an unforgettable story that somehow remains both heartbreaking and oddly unbelievable more than a century later. 24. Hurricane Andrew created an entire business boom. When Hurricane Andrew slammed into South Florida in 1992, it became one of the most destructive hurricanes ever to strike the United States. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, more than 60,000 homes were destroyed, and billions of dollars in damage forced communities to rebuild almost from scratch. The storm exposed serious weaknesses in building standards, and suddenly everyone wanted stronger homes. Construction companies quickly began advertising hurricane-resistant windows, reinforced garage doors, impact-rated roofing, and improved building techniques. Insurance companies promoted discounts for safer construction, while manufacturers proudly labeled products as hurricane-approved. In other words, disaster completely reshaped an industry. Nobody wanted another Andrew, but businesses recognized that homeowners would gladly invest in protection if it meant sleeping a little easier during hurricane season. Unlike some examples on this list, this commercial response genuinely improved public safety. Still, it perfectly fits America's pattern. A devastating catastrophe revealed a problem, and before long there were television commercials, showroom displays, and glossy brochures promising that the next storm would find your house ready for the challenge. 25. The 1904 Baltimore Fire turned standardization into a product. The Great Baltimore Fire of 1904 burned for more than 30 hours, destroying over 1,500 buildings across the city's business district. Firefighters from nearby cities rushed in to help, but many discovered that their hoses couldn't connect to Baltimore's hydrants because different cities used different coupling sizes. It was a small technical problem with enormous consequences. The disaster became a wake-up call for manufacturers, engineers, and local governments. Soon afterward, companies began promoting standardized firefighting equipment that could work across multiple cities. Fire safety catalogs proudly advertised compatibility and reliability as major selling points. It wasn't the most glamorous product ever marketed, but it may have been one of the most important. America had learned the hard way that even tiny differences in equipment could make a disaster far worse. The lesson became an entire market built around uniform standards and dependable engineering. Sometimes the best-selling innovation isn't flashy at all. Sometimes it's simply a hose that actually fits the hydrant when the whole neighborhood is on fire. 26. The 1900 Galveston hurricane built a new city to visit. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history, killing an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 people after a massive storm surge overwhelmed the Texas island city. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath the water, and many believed Galveston would never recover. Instead of abandoning the city, engineers attempted something extraordinary. They raised much of the city by several feet and built a massive seawall stretching along the coast. The engineering project became almost as famous as the disaster itself. Visitors traveled to Galveston not only to enjoy the beaches, but also to see one of the most ambitious rebuilding efforts in American history. Museums, historical tours, books, and visitor centers tell the remarkable story of how an entire city literally lifted itself higher after unimaginable destruction. That's probably the most American ending possible. Faced with catastrophe, the response wasn't simply to rebuild, it was to rebuild bigger, stronger, and eventually invite tourists to come admire how it was done. Even resilience became something worth putting on a brochure. 27. The San Francisco cable cars survived disaster and became the brand. If there is one perfect ending to this story, it's San Francisco's cable cars. After the devastating 1906 earthquake and fire, much of the city's transportation system was destroyed along with thousands of buildings. During Reconstruction, many people argued that the aging cable cars should disappear forever in favor of faster electric streetcars and buses. But public support kept them alive, and over time they transformed from everyday transportation into one of America's most recognizable tourist attractions. Today, millions of visitors willingly stand in long lines, buy tickets, collect souvenirs, and photograph the very system that survived one of the country's greatest urban disasters. The cable cars became more than transportation. They became a symbol of resilience that also happens to generate millions of dollars in tourism every year. It perfectly sums up America's strange talent. A disaster threatens to erase part of history. People refuse to let it disappear, and eventually someone figures out how to print it on postcards, refrigerator magnets, coffee mugs, and t-shirts. Sometimes survival itself becomes the country's best-selling product. Turns out, America never wastes a good story. The question is, which disaster-turned business surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments.